On behalf of RZIM Canada and INTRICITI, welcome to Reimagine, an opportunity to explore life's new questions. As a means of introduction, my name is Alana Walker-Carpenter, and I will be your host. Whether you have a little faith, a lot of faith, or no faith at all, we hope that this will be a safe landing ground for us to be able to explore justice in amongst the chaos and uncertainty. For those of you who are engaged on social media, our hashtag is Reimagine 2020. That's Reimagine 2020. And for those of you who would like to engage in our live Q&A, simply click on the right-hand side of your screen where it says questions. It is my privilege to introduce to you both of our panelists today. First, Alycia Wood, our itinerant speaker with RZIM. Alycia has a heart for justice, both locally and globally. She has a degree in criminal justice and sociology and has a master's in social justice. You can find her speaking on university campuses, in prisons, and everything in between. We are delighted to have you today, Alycia. Welcome. And Sonja Salmon, founder and chair of Ebby, Rane. Sonja is currently the head of the Western Caribbean for Sol Petroleum International. Previously, she was general counsel and the chief risk officer at HSBC. She was the director of strategy for the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board and senior counsel at RBC. She is known as a collaborator, a relationship builder, and a visionary. Sonja is married to Greg, and together they have two beautiful boys. Welcome, Sonja. So let's get started. First, ladies, I'm just going to ask both of you an individual question. Then we're going to transition to Alycia. And then Sonja, you and I will come back and we will continue this robust, honest, vulnerable conversation about justice today. So Alycia, this first question is for you. A search for justice cannot become a campaign for revenge. Cannot become a campaign for revenge. How can we honor relationships in the process of justice to ensure we move forward and not backwards?
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. And just want to say welcome, everybody. Just really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you about such a topic that I'm sure is on all of our minds. I think it was Nietzsche who once said, beware lest in fighting the dragon, you become the dragon. And I've considered that often whenever I deal with many things in life. We do want to remember that when we are engaged in any kind of justice cause or any kind of cause where we're bringing about change, that we are dealing directly with people that actually do have emotions of love and empathy and compassion. And even though we're on the wrong side, sometimes that can be, or on different sides, it can almost seem like it's impossible for us to envision that that's what they also have those capabilities. And so I think, number one, keeping things so that they are not personal against somebody else, but that they are remembering that this is a person who actually has the ability to see the side that you are on as well. But there are certain tensions or things that are happening in between there that are causing problems and causing conflict. So I think that's a number one thing. And number two, we want to make sure that we don't ever act out of revenge or spite. That will allow us to fight nasty. That will allow us to bring things into the conversation that don't need to be there. And it will almost put up a wall where we won't even be able to necessarily meet somebody part way or really be able to engage in a helpful dialogue or conversation with somebody because we're so full with rage and emotion. And so I think the human element needs to be a part of these conversations, that we're dealing with people that have the ability to change and to love and to see truth. And if we keep that in mind, we will be much better at approaching these conversations in the right way.
Oh, such a great start to our conversation, Alycia. There's that human element that we cannot act in a spirit of revenge. We cannot act in a spirit of revenge and keeping things so they're not so personal. And I would add even just having listening ears, coming into the conversation with a listening spirit and a learned spirit. Sonja, this next question is for you. You, quote unquote, had the perfect childhood. If we think about 0 to 5, you were brought up into the most loving family. It's kindergarten. You're in kindergarten. That redhead boy behind you knocks on your shoulder. And for the first time, you hear the N word. That redhead boy calls you the N word. Describe to us what changed in that moment for you and how that changed your path.
So I remember that day, and I remember not being sure what it meant at 5 years old. Certainly the gravity and the weight, Alana, of understanding what is embedded in that word, as few letters as it is, and what sort of hatred can be embedded in that word was completely unknown to me. And I remember going home and asking my parents, somebody called me this, and what does it mean? And how challenging it must be now that I am a parent to have that conversation. And I don't recall, I'll be honest, what they said, but I can recall how I felt, because it was more a matter of my parents helping me to understand that I was loved for who I am, perfectly loved for the person that I was. As the journey from that point went on, and you are absolutely right, I had a wonderful childhood in a wonderful Christian home where my parents really tried to anchor us in loving, even through challenging situations. That was sadly not the last time I heard that. But as I evolved in age and I became more mature and more prepared to understand the context and which those things happened, my parents taught us to pray through those circumstances, and we would pray for the individuals that called me the N-word. And I think that is powerful as a parent now, to not react in a place of immediately looking for retribution, to look to others and to have some form of consequence. We prayed for them, prayed for that child and many others in the years that followed under those circumstances. So much more I could say on that, but for now I will tell you the journey of learning about the injustice when you feel that you have been marginalized or differentiated, particularly through the eyes of a child, is something I'm so acutely aware of now as a parent.
Thank you, Sonja. I think that that's a poignant reminder that we remember how people make us feel. We remember how people make us feel. And the power in praying for our enemies, and for those people that aren't that are on the call today and might not share in the same faith background that we do, just maybe the power of trying to understand somebody else's story to further that journey, the power of trying to understand somebody else's story. This is a great start to the conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation. We're going to transition over to Alycia, and then we look forward to joining you. Over to you, Alycia.
Oh, thank you so much. And, when I went to school and studied various justice degrees, one thing I didn't imagine was where we would be in the world today. And so obviously justice and inequality and tension between a variety of different groups is something that we are all dealing with if we've been alive for the last 7, 8 months, 7, 10 years even, as we have wrestled globally with human life and how we treat and respond to other people. So I just thank you for the opportunity to have a few minutes to share some thoughts with you today. And I want to just start off by just sharing with you 2 stories. You may have heard of both of them. You may have heard of none of them. One was fairly recent, and it happened actually in Georgia, one of the states in the southern part of the United States. A gentleman named Ahmaud Arbery, 25 years old, was jogging when 2 gentlemen, George McMichael, who was the father, and Travis McMichael, who was the son, saw that he resembled somebody that they had previously seen burglarize or enter into a property that they shouldn't have been entering into. And they decided to pursue him. They wanted him to stop. He ran and they pursued, but then eventually they pursued him in a white pickup truck. Eventually, Ahmad stopped and actually faced them and tried to confront them, and he was shot with a shotgun, and as by the son, Travis McMichael, and as Ahmad lay dying, Travis steps over him and looks over him and calls him two things: the F word and the N word, the FN and the N word. Several years ago, nearly 8 years ago now, a young girl in Delhi, India, Jyoti Singh, had gone with her friend to the movie theater. And they'd finished around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. They left the theater. It was a male friend, and they had boarded what they believed was a bus to just take a bus home. And turns out it wasn't a bus. Turns out, well, it looked like all the other buses that they have in India, this one actually had 7 young men on there who were intent in bringing great harm. They beat up the boyfriend, or the friend, actually, he wasn't a boyfriend. They beat up the friend, and then they proceeded to gang rape Jyoti one by one. When they were finished, they threw her and the boyfriend the friend out of the bus, and somebody walking by saw them bleeding on the side of the road, and was able to call police, and they got them into the hospital. Sadly, Jyoti's damage was so severe and intense that she died from the injuries from the rape about 2 weeks later. This particular story raised to the forefront in India the question of justice. Many were calling for justice in India, where at the same time, many in India were also wondering, had there been an injustice that had even occurred at all against Jyoti? The driver of the bus was interviewed, and he was actually sentenced to death. But his comments, even after his sentencing, included, I'll just read you some of them: a decent girl won't roam around at 9 p.m. Our girl was far more responsible for a rape than a boy. About 20% of girls are good. Boys and girls are not equal. I love that people care about justice with 2 degrees in it. Clearly, it's something that I am passionate about as well. But as we reflect on the responses of both Travis McMichael, who was the one who shot and killed Ahmaud Arbery, and we look at the response of the bus driver, who said, basically, a decent girl will roam around at 9 o'clock and boys and girls are unequal. We look at the response of him to Jyoti Singh's death. We see come to the forefront of the justice conversation 2 very important issues. What is the value of a human being? And what really is morally right or wrong? And this is important for us to think through, because in order for us to carry out justice, we need to know that an action is wrong, and that something that was value has been violated. And so the remainder of the time, I want to see if we can look at these 2 issues together, so that we can become better people to understand justice, but also to carry it out. And perhaps we can do that by first looking at this idea of morality, right? Injustices are essentially moral violations. And so in order to carry out justice, we have to know whether or not there's actually been a moral law that's been violated. But this is tricky, okay? Why? Because we come to morality in a variety of ways. Some people look to the government for morality. Some people say, well, the government can tell me what's right and wrong, or that we let the laws of the land determine morality for us. Others look to morality within ourselves, kind of like an egoism view. I have the ability to be able to determine for myself and others what I think morality should be. Some other people come to the conclusion about what is right or wrong based on allowing the culture to decide. So maybe the culture is able to come up with a majority vote on a particular issue. And excuse me, and as a result of that, we're able to decide as a culture, this is right or this is wrong. Another way could be that morality is decided by what's good for the greatest number of people. Maybe we say, well, you know what? it seems like this particular situation will benefit the greatest number of people. And so therefore, that's the decision we'll go with. So because there's such a variety of ways that we come down with morality within our own culture, and even between culture to culture or country to country or continent to continent, we have such a variety of views on what actually is right or wrong. But it's important to note that even though we have this variety, and even though we have these differences, we all still have our own particular view. We all have an individual framework that we base morality on, whether it comes from ourselves, the government, the culture, whatever. But what's interesting is that morality can be carried out even in immoral systems. Even in an immorally corrupt company, let's say, which will allow you to, say, embezzle money from clients, they may not allow you to embezzle money from the company. So even within a moral structure, you can have other moral frameworks that even may provide certain contradictions, or even an immoral framework might have a standard of morality. But regardless of which one of these standards that somebody applies, that somebody adheres to, these are all subjective, right? The culture could go one way here in 2020 and go somewhere different in 2021. The government can say something is legal in 2020 and say it's illegal in 2021. You know, in America, we've done this with marijuana. Okay, for years, marijuana was illegal. And then the government, we locked thousands and thousands of people, adults, men, women, children, meaning juveniles, locked them up for years for drug offenses related to marijuana. And now we're saying it's legal. Okay, so now people aren't necessarily being locked up at the same rate that they were before. Okay, so now you have a shift where the government can say in 1 year, this is wrong, and then morality can shift in the next year. Morality is important. How do we know whether or not we've carried out an injustice if we don't know whether or not something is wrong here? So out of all these ways that I've mentioned, these are all subjective. Now, there is more objective ways to come down with morality, and those are usually going to be found in something like religion. Regardless of which religion somebody adheres to, religion oftentimes uses a divine source, or maybe divine sources if there's multiple gods, to help people come to the determination of what right or wrong is. So morality comes from a divine being, and that makes it much more concrete. Whatever this divine being says is the way that we go. But that still can lead to an inconsistency across a people group, or across a nation, or from nation to nation. Why? Because people have different religions, and not all the divine sources have the same moral code. So once again, people oftentimes can disagree on when is there an injustice that's happened, because they don't know about which moral code to follow. So one of the questions we need to think about when we're looking at this question of justice is, do we have an accurate moral code so we know when an injustice has happened? Do we have an accurate moral code so that we can tell another country, hey, you are treating your people incorrectly? Do we have an accurate moral code so we can tell a people group, even within our own country, hey, you need to address this issue. There is something wrong that you are doing here. So we need to establish as a people group what really is right or wrong, and really come to a consensus on where our source is. Because without that source, we won't really know whether or not injustices have been committed. Now, what about this other issue that we need to look at? This other issue of value. Value is important. We advocate for justice for things that we value. Okay, so we advocate for environmental justice because we see value in the environment. But we're not going to advocate for justice for a rolled up paper towel, let's say, because there isn't necessarily value in a rolled up paper towel. Okay, so where we put value determines where we think the violation, the immoral action has happened, or who we think it's happened against, or maybe what if it's an environment. Okay, so when the words that you choose to say over somebody when they are lying there dying after you shoot them are the two words that Travis McMichael chose, then you see that there's no question as to what he believed the value of Ahmaud Arbery's life actually was. And what you see is, you see in the case of Jyoti Singh, that the boys are coming from a culture where the value of men and women are not equal. And it's much easier to rape a young woman when you don't view her as a person. And this is exactly what happened. You dehumanize someone, you see them as an object, and that enables you to remove the feelings of guilt or shame that you have in carrying out an action against an object, because the object isn't real, or the object doesn't have feelings, or the object isn't valued. In both cases, we see the striking similarity of what happens when you devalue human life. It's easier for you to abuse it and to take it. And we see this idea of value, devaluing, as something it makes it easier for us to abuse something. But this is a trivial example, but this might help hit the point home for us, is if you think of a child who's jumping out of bed. Okay, they jump and jump and jump without concerns for how the bed feels. Okay, but they wouldn't do that to a person. Why? Because there's value in the person that there isn't in the bed. So you jump on the bed and you don't feel bad because it's just an object. You jump on a person and you feel differently. Okay, if I wake up in the morning and I step on an ant, nobody has an issue with it. If I wake up in the morning and step on my ant, we have an issue. The difference between value systems is important here. So when you dissociate a human from its humanity, you open up the floodgates for abuse that will take you to places you never thought you could go. So once again, the minute you devalue life, the minute it's not easier for you to take it. And so, like morality, there's things that we need to ask ourselves as humans to determine, what do we now think is valuable when it comes to justice? For some, values determined based off of their achievements. If you're able to contribute certain things to society, maybe you're more valuable than somebody else. For some, it's based off of your gender, male being more important than females. For some value, we determine value of somebody based on our religious framework. For some people, they determine the value of somebody based on race. So maybe somebody who is white is more valuable than somebody who's not. Maybe someone who's light-skinned more valuable than somebody who's not skinned. Maybe we determine value based off of a caste system. Whatever it is, we have a variety of ways in which we determine the value of a human being. The list goes on and on and on, but we need to ask ourselves, where do we determine value from? How do I know that I should care about my aunt? How do I know that I should care about the life of Jyoti Singh? How do I know that Ahmaud Arbery should not have suffered the death that he suffered? Over the last several months, there's been a variety of racial tensions, you could say, happening in the U.S., and they've been helpful in a variety of ways in helping people to do a lot of self-reflection as to where in their lives they may knowingly or unknowingly have been unjust. And so as leaders who are reimagining justice, I think it's an important exercise to do. Let's not be afraid to ask ourselves, where do I get my moral framework from? And how has it impacted the way I treat others? How has it impacted how I treat my colleagues? How has it impacted those I supervise? How has it impacted my clients? How has it impacted people on lower end of pay scales? How has it impacted my circle of family and friends? Same thing with value. How have I determined who is valuable and consequently mistreated or elevated someone because of it? Once again, how have I determined the value of my colleagues? How have I determined the value of those that I supervise, those clients that I engage with, people on the lower end of the pay scale, family and friends? And as we think through these questions, we in turn can look around us and ask the same things of our work environment as a whole. Where do you see people not being valued? Where do you see people being taken advantage of? And what power struggles might there be that might be unfair? So before we turn over to a time of Q&A, I think it's helpful for us to have these moments of reflection, Because before we can even carry out justice, before we can even listen to what Sonja just shared and say, man, that doesn't sound right, we need to realize that we are coming at it through a particular lens. And we need to understand, is that lens right? Is that correct? Because if it's wrong, we will miss the injustices around us, and we won't be a part of the solution. We will be part of the group of offenders.
Alycia, thank you so much. I think, if anything, you've given us the tools to be able to ask these questions that we need to ask ourselves, and we need to ask our organizations. And it might be uncomfortable, but that's okay. I think sometimes we get too comfy and we need to get uncomfortable. Thank you so much, Alycia. I'm going to invite Sonja back into the conversation. Sonja, I was recently reading an article in the Report on Business. This particular article was about the president of Capital One. And she said that most of the discrimination in her career can be attributed to being underestimated. So being underestimated based on her race and sex. And this Saturday night, my husband and my little boy and I were watching a documentary on Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. They had strung it all together. And Michelle said something that really struck me. She referred back to her high school guidance counselor that indicated that Princeton was beyond her, that Princeton was beyond her. You have had your own experiences in public school, when you were in law school, and when you landed your first job at Canada's top law firm. Take us through your journey and help us, Sonja, to learn from it.
Thank you, Milana. And first of all, may I say to Alycia, incredible remarks, and thank you. Thank you for giving me a new framework also for thinking about justice. Thank you, Alana. I introduced with my story at the age of 5, but as I had alluded to, there were a number of other points in my life where this became acute, and I would never wish to suggest that it dominated all of my life, because I, by the grace of God, feel that I live every day with a joy in my heart, and these are things that I have encountered, but they have not defined the person I wake up to be every day. They have informed me, however. They have informed me in a way that allows me to be a better mother, and I believe a more compassionate individual when I see other things happening around me. But my very, very first time feeling in line with the CEO of Capital One was in grade 8. And I'll quickly share this story. I was blessed to be a high performer. And I think in many ways I studied and worked hard to be able to demonstrate that I was always worthy of being in those classes in grade school. But I had graduated at the top of my class in grade 8 with the highest average and had expected to receive the academic award. And we were attending the grade 8 graduation. I was there with my parents, and they announced the academic award and they named another young boy. And that young boy had been in all my classes, and I knew unequivocally that I had a higher grade point average and had done better than him, but I was stunned literally at the moment that they called his name. What was more disappointing, however, was that following that, they called the Athlete of the Year and Sports Award, and that's when my name was called. And I was devastated because I wanted to be recognized for what I had earned. And it may not initially sound like it ties in with your story, but it absolutely does, because there is oftentimes a presumption that as a Black child, as a Black woman, academic inclination is not the presumption. That you're going to excel academically is not the presumption. That you would excel in athletics, however, is perfectly acceptable. And so in my very first opportunity to express what I now know as activism or defiance, I refused to take the stage at the young age of 12 for that award. I absolutely refused to rise from my seat. And they called my name again. And my parents were looking at me initially and I absolutely sat and refused to move. So after 3 attempts, they moved on. And there's many other things I could say on that, but I will say this, it was a defining moment for me. And I recognized that I did have the power in my own response to choose how I wish to be in those very, very specific moments in time. And you are right, the journey continued, and I have unfortunately found that there have been many times in my life where I have entered a room and the presumption has not been made that I was either there for the meeting or that I was there to lead the transaction. But I typically use those opportunities really, and this is where Alycia mentioned how much the last year has opened things for discussion and conversations are happening that really have not happened in the past. Because where I have built relationships with people and we've had awkward moments in our history where they've either made an assumption about me or I've been underestimated, I come back to it at the right time and we unpack it, because at a certain point when people begin to understand we're people and we begin to build a relationship and that relationship goes beyond those first assumptions, it's an opportunity to open up and discuss.
Thank you, Sonja. I take from that we might not always be able to control the situation, but what we can control is our response. Our response.
Very much so.
Alycia, this next one's for you. This is a question that's come in. And so this question is from obviously somebody that shares your heart of justice. It's a beautiful question. It says, how do we advocate for and serve those who are the most vulnerable when there are so many restrictions in place? How do we do it real time right now?
Yes. And I would even add on to the challenge of that question. How do we reach the most vulnerable when it seems like there's so many of them and it can almost seem overwhelming? One of the things I encourage people to do is, and I'm assuming the restrictions they're talking about are because of the COVID and we're all kind of isolated right now, outside hasn't been open for 7 months, and, one thing I encourage people to do is to always begin with your circles. I think change really starts with, it doesn't always have to start with these big, massive things. How about let's just look around at my people group and let me be the one to listen in my group. Let me be the one to engage in conversation and dialogue in my group. Let me be the one to cry where I need to cry, to ask forgiveness where I need to ask forgiveness, to do better I need to. And so we can do those where we are now because we have phones and we've got the ability. Don't text. Let's not turn this into a text kind of conversation, but we have the ability to be able to have these conversations with people right now, whether it's video like we're doing or even over phone. And let's begin with making changes in our circles. And so even that just begins a small ripple effect that we can already begin to do to start making about change. We don't need to wait for things to happen on a big scale. We are dealing with humans. And human to human interaction is what we need, especially when it comes to pain, especially when it comes to injustice, especially when it comes to suffering. And so I think that's what we can do is say, what are there neighbors? Are there family members? Are there friendships that I can be honest with, that I can invest in, and at least say if somebody's experiencing injustice over here, at least they can say they're not going to experience that with Alycia. They're not going to experience that with Sonja. They have a different experience with me. And so that is what I would encourage people to do, is start where you're at and begin to plow the ground where you are. Change can happen on small scales. In fact, a lot of change happens on small scales. The civil rights movement in America started very small and it grew, right? So go ahead and allow those individual people that are in your circles to be the beginning of the launch pad of the movement within your own community.
Thank you, Alycia. One of my favorite quotes is from Gandhi: be the change you want to see, be the change you want to see. And I concur. It is the small things, and I would say it's often the unseen things that really make the most profound difference. Sonja, this next question is for you. A number of organizations formally released statements after the murder of George Floyd, and some did not. Thinking of your own experiences, what are you looking for from corporations at this solemn time in history?
A great question, Alana. And there are so many dynamics and layers to that. Living through the past year, there have been moments of reflection that have brought me to tears. It has unlocked for me a lot of my childhood experiences. And what it has opened up is, as we talked about, a set of conversations, because there have been insights through video cameras for injustices that have unfortunately been happening for the test of time. But we as a collective global community have finally seen them. So I am, on one level, incredibly encouraged that there's a level of awareness about this and that we are engaging in dialogue, and that some of the systemic elements of this that exist in corporations is finally being discussed. I am very encouraged by that. Where I want to believe is that this will be sustainable, and that this will not be a news cycle, and that we are recognizing that there's an opportunity for profound change that can be made incrementally. To the point Alycia made, and you, I agree. It isn't necessarily about a pendulum swing and everything can be fixed in a moment. It is small, incremental steps of change. It is a mind shift. It is a change of thought. Awareness comes from conversation. Awareness comes from education. Awareness comes when we engage and we begin to recognize that some may be inadvertent, but there may be biases that we are bringing that are really changing the shape of advancement for certain communities. And so the statements that came out, I think that to a large extent represent an opportunity that those companies are having dialogues, and I encourage them to continue to do so at every level in the organization, for an opportunity for introspection about maybe policies that may be impacting individual careers. But in terms of the external component of this, I think that this is an important time for people to identify when they are allies of this type of cause. It is just very important. There is something that comes from knowing that there has been a moment of someone recognizing, I understand and have empathy for some of the experiences that you've had. And through that now, I think that begins to change their thinking. So let's move beyond words and statements. It's a great starting point, but we each have a responsibility, and we each have a place to play in this and participate.
Thank you, Sonja. We need to move beyond words and responsibilities. And we have not only a collective responsibility, but an individual responsibility. Sonja, I'm going to give you this next question because I want to end with the last question with Alycia. Mm-hmm. So, Sonja, you and I are the mother of boys. We have a 12-year-old boy and a 16-year-old boy. I was gutted when I was reading an article in the Globe and Mail about a young mother who is deeply concerned about raising a Black son. And in the summer, I was listening to a podcast, and an 11-year-old boy called in and said, "I'm afraid of being Black. I'm afraid of being Black." What is it like to be a Black mother?
And a Black mother of Black sons, because there is a difference in how my sons are viewed, even compare to young Black girls. This is something very near and dear to my heart, Alana. It's an area that my husband and I reflect on, pray about all the time. But one of the things I can say is that we have been very open with our boys. We have been very open with our boys about the perceptions that can be had by people when they are out in the community. And there are some unfortunate injustices in these children have to behave in a certain way. They have to conform in a certain way in order to avoid certain things. So, one of the things I think about is I tell my boys specifically that if it's chilly if it is chilly, you always have to have another jacket in your bag. I cannot allow you to pull your collar up or to throw your hoodie up. And maybe that is not advice that every mother has to give, but I certainly have to give it because I have 2 young Black boys. And unfortunately, there is a perception about a young Black boy with a hood pulled over their heads. And, you know, things can happen, very bad things can happen very quickly. So we have an open conversation. I've had recently, I'll tell you, Alana, I have been challenged about whether was it right for me to even engage my boys on these things, is for them to understand the presumptions that are made often about them when they step out of our home into the world. But I feel I'm doing a disservice for them to not prepare them for the realities of what is out there. I want them to be empowered and I want them to understand. So allowing it to unravel and then we unpack it, I feel is putting them at a disadvantage. They are going to experience certain discrimination at certain points in their life. And preparation, I feel, allows them to be most empowered in those moments and to make choices in those moments.
Thank you, Sonja. I have to say, as a white mother, you know, the experiences that you have really got me. I'm teaching my child how to show up on time, tie his shoelaces. And I see Black mothers teaching their child not to wear hoodies, teaching their child to put their hands on the steering wheel when they are stopped by a police officer. So much for us to continue to think about. Alycia, this next question is for you to help us go forward. The world has raised countless questions and concerns of this inequality that society must confront if we are to return to normal. We must confront this. But even so, normal is not good enough. If we have learned anything, it is that we cannot really prevent or contain the virus without addressing concerns of inequality. Alycia, where do we go from here?
Yes, where do we go from here? Well, a couple thoughts I have on that. I think where we go from here is we begin to say, okay, there seems to be some serious issues happening within society. And it looks like I really need to come down and help determine where I stand on rights and wrongs, human value, and these kind of things. And I think this is where the Christian perspective for me is very helpful. Because with a lot of that arbitrariness with subjective morality, whether it's the culture decides, the government decides, whoever decides, the Christianity kind of gives me that framework of actually morality is grounded in the nature of God himself. In other words, something is a good action because God is the good itself. So that lets me know that when I want to say something is right or wrong, I know it actually is right or wrong. So I know that forgiveness is good because God is forgiving. I know that restoration, reconciliation is good. It's because God believes in reconciliation. I know that love is good because God is love itself. In other words, the good characteristics that we're looking for exist within the nature of God. And that, number one, that first step lets me know that, okay, when I see that this is wrong, I know it actually is wrong because I have a source of morality that I can trust. And I think the second thing where we can go from here is we can do the same, something similar with value. You know, when I go into an art museum and I see a beautiful painting, one of the first things that actually any of us are going to do is to say, who did that painting? Who's the artist? Why? Because a part of us appreciating this painting is going to be determined by us knowing the name of the artist. And once we see, oh, this is a Da Vinci, or this is Chagall or something like that, all of a sudden the value soars. In other words, it's the artist who gives value to the artwork. And within Christianity, because I have a God who says that I created humanity, then his name is on us as the creator. And so I know humans have value. So I can go from here now saying, I know what's right or wrong now. And I know it is not okay to chase a 25-year-old young man down the street and then shoot him dead and then use those words over his life. I know what's important when it comes to value, and a young girl should not be treated as if she is an object because she went to the movies with a young man at night. And the third thing I can say that we can go from here, that because of the Christian framework helps me to go forward, is it also helps me to learn about reconciliation. Something I think the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee did beautiful in their response to apartheid. They demonstrated beautifully. But just this idea that we can reconcile with each other, we can forgive each other. And as a result of that, we can then move forward as one united body and no longer as a body of people who are bitter and divided with each other because we hold those past things against each other.
Thank you, Alycia. God is good. He is just. He's restorative. He wants to reconcile himself to us and redeem our world. Thank you, Alycia. Thank you, Sonja. For those of you who want to engage in the conversation more, we will be posting this at our respective websites, www.rzim.ca, www.intricity.ca. Next week, we have the opportunity to reimagine suffering with Diane Craig, who is the founder and president of Corporate Class, and Naomi Zacharias, who is the director of Wellspring. I'm going to conclude our time today with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. As Dr. King said, "Good people who choose to remain indifferent and wait on time are just as damaging and deadly as the racists who carry bats and guns and walk the streets, killing those who are Black, who are brown, and who are red. The progress of our nations never happened because we sat around and waited for it. No, we've got to stand up. The time is now." Thank you for joining us.